You're listening to Season 2 of Conversations with Kathy, the podcast for women who are looking for a place filled with honest conversations, tangible takeaways, and new perspectives on life, love, and everything in between. And I'm your host, Katyan Roach. Let's jump right in. When I interviewed Lisa last year, I knew that this would be a challenging but necessary conversation. Dealing with grief is not something that many of us are prepared for. And when Lisa found herself having to deal with the sudden death of her husband and then a dear friend, she was forced to deal with grief head-on and work her way through it. Lisa is the host of the Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast, a social worker turned thought leader who uses the power of narrative to create a grief-smart culture. Let's jump right into my conversation with Lisa. Lisa, Thank you so much for joining me on Conversations with Kathy. I'm so happy that you took the opportunity to chat with me. I want to tell you in advance that I think this is one of the more difficult topics for me to talk about when it comes to grief. And I'm so happy that you've called the work that you do reimagining grief because we have to think about it differently. So I want you to give me a little idea of why this was something that you chose to delve into or talk about. Where did this come from?
Yeah, that's it. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on your show and for allowing me to bring this conversation of grief to your listeners, because 100% of us are going to experience it. And I agree that it's a difficult topic for people. Yeah. So I'm trying to make it a little bit easier. So I came to this work at Reimagining Grief really from a culmination of what I like to call my personal and professional resume, kind of from both places. So I've spent a career as a social worker. I trained as a narrative therapist. I worked in public housing, adoption, foster care, family services. So certainly seeing mental health issues related to grief and loss. But also in the midst of that career, at just the age of 40, I lost my husband. He died after a year of misdiagnosis. And in the years since that time, I then was with a very close friend when he died as well. Yeah. And what I was coming to understand, and the reason I do this work, is that I was recognizing the ways in which our systems, our language, our culture is completely sort of absent and in some ways maladaptive or problematic, kind of pathologizes grief. And with a career, with all this personal and professional experience combined, plus the combination of the work I've done as a founder, as a public speaker, a writer, I sort of felt, it didn't really feel like a choice, to be honest. Like I founded Reimagining Grief because it felt like the universe was pulling me in that direction. So I was like, I can't have gone through all of these things. I can't have had these experiences and have some of these skills, as a therapeutics, interviewer, et cetera, and not be a part of changing things for the better. Because as you said, as we started our conversation, so many people, including those of us who are going through grief, fear the topic. And that it's actually that fear that compounds the hardship of grief, I think.
Yeah, because I remember my father died when I was 11, and I remember him being ill at home and calling my mother to have this conversation about his dying. Yeah. And my mother refused to have that conversation. I mean, she broke down and she didn't want to talk about it. And I remember him calling me and my brother and trying to have the conversation with us to say that she didn't want to have it and he needed to let us know and prepare us. But at 10, I wasn't prepared for that. I never thought that my father would die. And as you talk about reimagining grief, I feel that I grieved for years and years and years over my father. Yeah. I had like a perpetual Sunday of feeling depressed all the time. And I didn't know what happened, why I was like that. And for years, I learned that I never really dealt with the loss of my father. I never really dealt with how his passing affected me and everything else around me. So even today, I still feel that it's something that I struggle with. That's why I'm so happy that I'm able to talk to you and have this conversation about grief and how do we deal with grief and the loss of people in our lives.
Yeah. Something you said, thanks for sharing that about your father with me. And my daughter was 7 when my husband passed, so I know she's gone through some of those things. But part of what you were just explaining are kind of important, I think I want to highlight, because it breaks down some of the myths and the problems that we have, which is somehow if we don't talk about it, it'll just go away. Yeah. But what happened is you were having these very valid and real responses to loss, sadness, probably anger, confusion, etc. But nobody was naming it or normalizing it or calling it grief. So on top of feeling rightfully devastated that your dad died, I can imagine there was also maybe another narrative going on in your head, which was like, well, what's wrong with me? Why can't I snap out of it? Nobody seems to, like, nobody's acknowledging that this is totally normal. So I think that's, I mean, you really hit at the core, I think, of one of the reasons I do this work. And the other is, and this, I tread lightly when I say this because it scares people sometimes. I believe that we will always grieve a substantial relationship. It's not this, we're going to wrap it up in a neat little package and be done. And like, okay, it's been, we're going to check off our top 10 list, or we're going to get through our stages. We integrate the grief and we can grow from it, and it can actually influence our lives in beautiful ways. But I don't think of grief as something that we get to that. Yeah, we're done grieving when we're done on, Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your experience with grief in terms of the loss of your husband and your friend.
Yeah, my own experience of grief was an interesting one, as is everybody's. I think because I was a clinically trained social worker at the time and a clinician, in some ways I was harder on myself because I had this underlying belief that I should somehow know how to do this and feel better and get better and, somehow like be my own therapist, which of course doesn't work. My grief is complicated in some ways, like I'm sure for so many, because my husband was misdiagnosed for the year before he died. He died of a grapefruit-sized brain tumor that had shifted his brainstem. But for the year before he died, doctors were blowing us off, and his behavior and who he was, as you can imagine, with a tumor that large in your brain, was changing substantially. So was our relationship in our family. And so in some ways, I think I was already experiencing a different kind of grief in the year before he died. Not the same anticipatory grief that people experience, like with a chronic illness or a terminal illness where someone's dying, because I didn't know that until the end. I'll tell you about that. But I had a kind of grief, like, what happened to the man? Who is this man in my house? And I don't think we talk about grief enough in the ways in which it happens beyond death loss. We can grieve people who are still very much alive. So I think I started my grief in some ways, of course, before he died. And then we had 2.5 weeks between his diagnosis and when he died in my arms. 10 or so days of that, he was in a coma, so was not even conscious for that time. So my grief was all-encompassing, as it is for so many people. It was shock, devastation, guilt.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that because I can imagine there's so many emotions in that moment, because at one point you're probably thinking, like you said, who is this man? Do I want to continue living with him and this type of person he's becoming? And then to find out that it wasn't his fault, and then to have to deal with all of those thoughts that you may have had. So I can understand the rush of different types of emotions, grief, the confusion, all of those things.
Anger. I was angry at doctors. I still am, frankly, angry at doctors for, blowing us off. Yeah. And I think guilt is a common emotion, even for people who don't have the experience I had where, of that time, just what could I have known? Could I have done differently? And I definitely had that. Thankfully, Eric and I had some time between very short, but between his diagnosis and between his first 14-hour surgery, which then resulted in him being in a coma. Until he passed. And so we were able to connect with each other and honor and acknowledge we both, what we both never understood and in that time. And so, but yes, there's been tremendous amount of guilt that I've had over the years. And again, I think it's a pretty common experience. I mean, I was a pretty strong, mouthy advocate with the doctors, and still they didn't listen to us. And what if I had pushed harder? What if I had what if? And I would say for the most part, I have really worked through the guilt and learned to let go of that and to understand that we did the best, both of us did the best we could with what we knew at the time. But that was a real struggle for a long time after. And of course, then recognizing that now my daughter is left without a father. And I felt very much a broken person, but understood that I had to be somehow not broken so that I could be the single mother to my daughter. And so that work of my own grief was certainly seeking out my own mental health support, my own grief guide, mindfulness and meditation, which we can talk about as a big tool in my toolkit around grief. But still, I saw that the world around me, even the friends and family that I knew that loved me and wanted to care for me, had some problematic beliefs around grief, one of which was that my grief needed fixing.
Right.
And I think that's one of the biggest myths that I try to bust, especially for people who want to show up for other people in grief, which is that it's somehow our job to go fix the grieving person. It's going to be okay. Yes. Or all the horrible things people say, by the way. Like, don't ever tell somebody they're in a better place now. Please. Yes. I'm looking right into the camera. Do not do that if we're watching this on video, or listen to my voice. Don't say that. I launched an entire line of empathy cards just to give people the language that they needed. So, but I recognized people were showing up and trying to fix me, and in their effort, or they wouldn't show up because they didn't know how to fix me. So then I felt further isolated because people sort of disappeared. And not all people. I had a lot of amazing support. So let me be clear. But other people would show up trying to, as you said, like, make it okay. And really what I needed, and what we all need, I think, which is a very different shift of mindset, is we need someone to bear witness to us. We need someone to hold space for us. We need someone to honor the pain and not fix it or pathologize it or rush it. And even though I had started new work, I had founded a new nonprofit supporting cancer patients. I had moved towns when my very close friend Joe finally succumbed to muscular dystrophy. I was also by his side. I was in the bed with my husband in the hospital when he died in my arms. And then I was with my friend Joe. And even though I was doing this other work where I was supporting, ill families, and again, sort of in that social work space, I sort of walked out of the hospital that day after Joe died in my arms, and again started to recognize the ways in which we are not supported sort of culturally to do the beautiful work of grief. And in some ways it is beautiful work. So all of that sort of resulted in me continuing to do my own work, which is your question. How did I do my work? I learned how to hold space for myself. I learned how to honor the complexity of my emotional experience. I worked doing journaling and mindfulness, worked with other practitioners who understood that I needed somebody to hold space. Lots of things, lots of tools in my toolkits. And that's really what's led me to be able to do the work I do individually with folks, the training work I do. Yeah.
So Lisa, I have two questions. So my first question would be, you said not to say it's going to be all right or you're in a better place. And most people don't know what to say other than that.
Yeah.
So what should we say? Somebody has lost a loved one. What do we say? Give me one thing that I should say instead of it's going to be okay.
I will preface by saying it depends on your relationship. If this is like a casual acquaintance versus this is your best friend, and the kind of dynamic you have, I sometimes use humor a little bit in my own, which seems a little odd, but I would say, this is hard. I'm here for you. Whatever you need. Or it's okay even to do that validating, like, hey, friend or sister or dad or cousin or whoever it is, I'm here. And I'm going to keep checking in. And I want to tell you that it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. So I imagine some feelings are going to come up, and whatever they are, please just honor them and just remember it's okay. I have a whole line of cards. I can give you lots of expressions. I'm here to help you carry their memory forward. But I think the underlying theme, Kathy, which is more important, is less about your words and more about your consistency in showing up. So the music Hamilton, right? Talk less, smile more. I will say talk less, listen more. That's good grief support advice.
Yeah, that is excellent. That is excellent because I feel now there is an issue with overwhelming grief. And when I say overwhelming grief is because we're exposed to the grief that everybody is having. So for example, you may have lived in a family where a neighbor died, in a community and you knew, but then other people were dying everywhere else, but you didn't. But now with social media and everything, it's like you're constantly aware of everybody else's pain, everybody else's grief. And for some of us, it can be overwhelming in terms
Excellent.
of there's always grief. It's my friend, it's my cousins, it's my friend's friend that has gotten cancer.
Yeah.
It's just all of the time. What would you say to help those of us who may be feeling overwhelmed by grief in the middle of COVID and everything else?
Yeah. That's so true. And even pre to this pandemic, I think some of us experienced that, where it felt like everywhere we turned,
Yes.
somebody we knew was experiencing grief. And now, of course, globally.
Yes.
I think what I would say to people is just to find softness for yourself, find space and grace for yourself. As far as the social media piece, one thing I would say is I think we have this voyeuristic tendency to feel like it's our obligation to be consuming it all. And I actually think that can be problematic. I think we need to find ways where we can, have kind of technology-free zones or kind of leave that. And it's not as if we're forgetting about people, but I would say, one thing I would say is about this collective grief is how can we create some spaces for ourselves? The second I would say is actually honor what it's bringing up for you about your own very personal grief. So I think we sometimes, it's in a way get easier, not easier, that's the wrong word. We get caught up in this sort of collective grief, but we ignore what it's bringing up for us in our very own personal grief, whether it's bringing up the memory of losing your dad, or for me, for my husband. And so I think listening inward to what is it inviting us to think about or to feel. And then I think depending on how this overwhelming grief is manifesting, if it's manifesting in sort of anxiety or overwhelm or like out of breath, that's absolutely where I think mindfulness and meditation practices are hugely important. Really connecting with our breath, settling our nervous system, because what's happening is our nervous system is kicking into fight, flight, freeze, right? We're like turning into our primal, that part of our brain back here, I call it our lizard brain. And so I think regulating our breath, extending our exhalations longer than our inhalations, which actually settles our nervous system and tells our body, you're okay. You are safe in this moment. And people are like, but it's my thoughts. But actually, your body's reaction is feeding and fueling those thoughts and emotions. And so when we settle into a regulated breath, which one of the easiest tricks is to extend your exhalations twice as long as your inhalations. And I can practice that or share that with you if you want. And then also to do some mindfulness or body scan, just get real present, because the overwhelm is like, I have to figure it all out, or I have to care for the world, or I have to tackle it all. And not just the breath, but the mindfully being present in this moment. Body scan meditation is one of my favorite. I lead for people when they're feeling overwhelmed. Helps us ground ourselves in this moment and ground our awareness in, yes, that is all difficult and heart-wrenching and sorrowful and angry-making and all the things. But when we can use mindfulness to bring ourselves to our bodies in this moment, we can again tell our nervous system and ourselves, actually, I'm safe. I'm in this chair. I'm okay. I believe in talk support. I offer grief guide support, and that's really important. But I think wherever you go, you can always use breath and mindfulness practices to help get you out of that sort of anxiety state or that anxious state and into some form of regulation, so that you can be more available and open to, a talk support session or some other session. But if you're too activated, you can't take that in. A real quick trick I would add before we continue is, if you're feeling real anxiety, like you're kind of in a panic state because you've maybe just absorbed too many news stories, one quick trick is to notice and name 5 things in your room. So what happens is when we get in this anxious state, we're either way in the past or we're way in the future, and we're kind of spiraling. And so I like to do something which you can do anywhere, pink pillow, blue jeans, gray and white rug, black headphones, silver computer. It just again helps you come back
to now.
To now, because the fear, the anxiety, the overwhelm is when our bodies and our minds are trying to take in all that's in the past and all that's in the future.
Yes.
Yeah.
I find sometimes what happens with that fear is that it comes to a place of saying that could be you. I've had friends who were very young and been diagnosed with cancer and died. And, when they're going through it, there's this part of you that goes, oh my God, maybe suppose it's me, suppose there's something wrong with me. And you have all of this fear hit you. Like you say, your future thinking now, suppose it's me. If this happens to me, maybe I'm sick. Maybe I don't know. And there's this overwhelming anxiety that comes over you. So I'm really glad that you're sharing some tips on bringing ourselves back down and focusing on it now and getting through those moments of anxiety and everything that you've said about social media, not taking on the weight of the world and finding a place. Do you think, because you mentioned it at the start, do you think that the way we deal with death and grief and loss is really a cultural thing, that there are other cultures who've learned how to celebrate this and it's just how we're conditioned?
1,000%, really at the root of how I think about how we learn grief from our families, from our culture. And I mean that sort of like, for me, I live in the US, so it's a very US white supremacist, frankly, Protestant kind of capitalistic culture that influences how we think about grief. I think we learn it, of course, from our spiritual or religious traditions, if you have one. And then also maybe your kind of smaller community between kind of the family and your country, like, how people do things in the Midwest of America or something like that. And so when you think about cultures around the world who don't think of our death, our bodies being an ending, but being sort of maybe more cyclical, when then you think about losing somebody or the death, and to name it a death, we have a different relationship with our loved ones than if we have, a different culture. And I think U.S. culture is problematic in lots of ways, frankly. We don't have time for that's a different show. But I think for grief, it's really problematic because we live in a culture that was built upon, even though it's falsely built upon, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's very capitalistic, so it's about productivity. We live in a culture that obsesses with happiness, and that's the only emotion worth having. And if you're not happy, you're doing something wrong. We live in a culture that encourages very solution-oriented. Everything is a problem, and everything has a quick fix, a solution. So when you think about the cultural, you might think about all that stuff and go, well, what does that have to do with grief? And I see it like inextricably linked to our grief, because what all those cultural message, and we're generally as a country not particularly, we don't have deep spiritual or religious traditions to offset any of that. I mean, writ large, not that people don't. So when you think that that's all that's around you, that's how paid time off is, that's how people talk to you, that's how social media, when you think about, we are swimming in this soup of culture. So then when your husband dies, and your boss calls you back to work because it's been 3 days and everybody's showing up and trying to fix you and everybody's telling you their story about the person who got over it real quick and they're celebrating the happy people in their life, then all of a sudden the actual experience of my grief, which is shock and numbness and anger and guilt and sadness and physical symptoms. We haven't even talked about the cognitive dysfunction that happens in your brain when you have early grief. They are completely incompatible. So my only conclusion is there must be something wrong with me. So I call that the unnecessary harm of grief. Grief is hard enough. Grief is, a death or other kind of loss, which maybe we can talk about. Other kinds of losses result in grief. It's hard enough. But then when you have a culture, or you're kind of sort of swimming in the culture that makes your very natural, normal, nonlinear, long-term grief process seem wrong, weird, abnormal, now you're compounded like must be something wrong with me.
I agree with you. When you mentioned those 3 days, it's so important the way that we just think, okay, you need to get over it. Or after the funeral, everybody's gone. Or like you've mentioned, different types of grief. So now in COVID, for example, people have lost their jobs. You lost your sense of identity. You may have to start over in a totally different field. And we do live in a culture that says, well, just move on to the next thing.
Buck up.
Yeah, let's just do this. You can do this.
Yeah.
And yes, we talk more about mental health and we talk about effects, like you said, cognitive, what's happening. But to me, it's still not something that is always acceptable, and it's something that people deal with in silence.
Yes. Well, and also, even though I do think, in the US, we're starting to talk a little bit more openly, I would say, about mental health, trauma, grief, etc. Our systems are not built to support that. So we still have most workplaces that don't offer any paid time leave or 3 days, or you have to use all your PTO. We still have workplaces that have leaders who get completely uncomfortable, who want you to show up as your full authentic self so that you can give the creativity and the productivity, but they don't want you to show up so much with your authentic self where you're crying or sad or you need time off, right? Yeah. So even though I do think we're making progress, and my mission, of course, is to help move this progress along. And I actually go into workplaces and help train workplaces on how to be grief smart so that I can help move it along. Even though we're making progress, which is great, progress, not perfection. We're always in achieving progress. The systems come into conflict with that. So I was the clinical director of a big family services nonprofit at the time that my husband died. I oversaw all the clinical interns, the clinical staff, plus I had, of course, my own clients and my own patients.
Yeah.
And my bosses, who are amazing women, if they're ever listening to this episode, amazing human beings, social worky people too, called me back to work, I think less than a week after my husband died, and said, can you please come back? All of our interns are starting. Our clinical staff don't know what to do. So even a supportive work environment that gets it, right? And the truth is I did. My daughter went back to school. I didn't. I was now the single who was going to earn the money. I had to. There are lots of reasons I went back. And I think that there was some good that came out of me coming back. But even systems that you would think are better set up to support an honest, authentic grief culture, if your systems aren't in place, it doesn't matter how much you talk about it. If your boss says, we care about our employees and we have so much empathy and we want to do, but they're sending you Slack channel messages 2 days after this funeral and asking when your deadlines are going to be, then it doesn't really...
Yes. And you touched on something that I want us to get into before we close, and that's children. You know, we don't know what to say to the kids. We don't know what to say to children. We really hope that they're going to get through this and they're going to get over it. And they seem to. You're a child, you've lost a parent, or you're in the middle of all of this grief and anxiety or everything that's happening right now. And nobody is really talking to you or teaching you the things that you're talking about here, how to get through grief, how to deal with grief. It's expected that you've had a traumatic experience and you're going to get past it. If we don't talk about it and it's not uncomfortable for anyone, and you're fine. What would you say to people listening in terms of how do we help our kids through traumatic experiences or grief type experiences?
Well, I do want to differentiate a little bit, sort of, not every grief experience is a trauma experience, but I would say in general, and again, it's always age appropriate. You're going to do and say different things to 2-year-olds, to 7-year-olds. But I would say in general, we're overly silent. So I think back to what I said about good grief support principles in general for adults applies to kids. So name it, acknowledge it, hold space for it. Don't try to fix it. So hey, Susie, I don't know, that's just the kid name. That's not even my daughter's name. Hey, Susie, I'm wondering, this is hard. Does this feel hard for you? Do you miss things? Just name it. You're not going to plant an idea in their head. You're not going to make it worse. What you're going to do is basically give them permission to say, oh, I'm not selfish. By the way, I think some people are I'm not allowed to be sad because I don't have COVID. And it's you get to be sad. You get to feel loss. So I think with our kids, age appropriate, in general, acknowledge, affirm, listen, keep checking in, encourage your kids to think about how have they been resilient, and help them notice for themselves. You know what, actually I adapted pretty well, and not try to force them into be happy or be grateful. You can be both and. You can be sad and proud. You can be angry or resentful and, hopeful.
Yes.
So I think just in general, be more honest and directive with your kids. Listen, allow them to, without trying to correct them or fix them. So allow them to get out because they're thinking it. Mm-hmm. So give it space, because we all know as adults, if you can go on a little thought cycle in your head.
Of course.
And she can be pretty, she can say some things internally in your head, right? And so same with our kids, they can do that. And if they can't get it out and then hear themselves say it, or have an adult reflect back to them to sort of affirm, yeah, I can imagine it's hard, but also to affirm, I want you to know I'm doing everything I can to keep you safe. Yes. So to reduce the fears. We won't know that unless we engage in conversation. So I think engaging in conversations over time is probably the best gift you can give your kids facing any kind of grief or traumatic event or traumatic series of events.
Now, Lisa, as we close, I listened to one of the interviews that you were at where your husband, you did a donation.
Yeah. How
has that given you any more, I don't know if the word closure, if there's such a thing as closure, but how has that helped you through your own grief process?
You're talking about the organ donation?
Yes.
Yeah. So we were only able to donate his eyes because the way the brain cancer had kind of affected the systems and the coma. He had wanted to be, both of us had wanted to be organ donors. We had talked about that long before even his illness. So that gave me some comfort. So please have those conversations with your loved ones, among many conversations we should be having.
Yeah.
I think for me, it was important. I wouldn't say it was the most significant thing that's helped me carry Eric's memory forward or feel good about the gift, that the legacy of Eric, although I do feel it just touches my heart to think like he has helped somebody else or other people, have eyesight. So that does give me comfort. I think the more important piece of that was more that it was something I knew that would be honoring what he wanted.
Right.
And that, I think when we don't have conversations when people are ill, or we don't talk about what we want before someone dies, part of the harm of grief is we're sent wondering, did I do what they wanted?
Yes.
Did I, was it the right thing or the wrong thing? And so for me, the organ donation, which of course happened right basically as I was leaving the hospital and arranging to have his body taken care of, allowed me one small sliver of, I know Eric wanted this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your story with me. I truly appreciate you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And thanks for having these really important conversations.
Thank you for listening to Conversations with Kathy. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. It helps others just like you to find the show. And if you want to connect with me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Katyan Roach, or in my Facebook group, Conversations with Kathy, where we connect live, discuss the episodes, and share tips for improving our lives. So until next time.